Oh, Mihaly. Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning that that Noah did something base. It wasn't wicked.
Right.
Is that an important distinction when it comes to applying that covering and that movement?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. 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 I do think so. So just for the recording, the question was the distinction that I made that Noah did something base, not like utterly wicked. Is that important for how we think through relation to the past and selective appropriation? And yeah, I think it is. There's times where things happen that are so dark, so deeply wrong that we need to. It needs to be said, and it needs to be corrected. And if my dad was the one that did it, then I should do something about that. If he's not around to do that. So I do think there's something to there. There's a certain degree of responsibility of being a part of a chain. Now that needs to be very carefully kind of thought through and assessed. There's been recently ideas about assigning blame that have nothing to do with, any actual, lineage or anything like that. It's just like you happen to be the same color or something like that. And I don't think that's appropriate. But I do think that if we, as it were, if we're living out of the benefits of somebody's life that included a fair bit of wickedness, then that probably we should think through, how we do that. So, yeah. So, yeah. Good question. I don't know if that was an adequate answer, but that was, yeah, Pantelis.
So the same prohibition concerning blood applies to Christianity, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah.
After the synod, the Apostolic Synod.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, is it so, or because Christians practically we don't,
Mm-hmm.
many other things, we just don't eat kosher or as a Jews.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, are you specifically asking, should we still be avoiding blood?
Exactly, because the same prohibition can be found, I think, in the Apostles' Acts.
Yeah, it's Acts 15.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the first synod in Jerusalem. So, a couple things. First of all, I think it's worth understanding the picture that we have of soul in Scripture. How can I put this? So I think it's metaphoric at some level to say that the soul is in the blood, which is what's behind, this prohibition. And yet there's a sense in which the fact that soul throughout the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is depicted in liquid terms. So it's also my soul. I pour out my soul, right? That it ends up, the picture of it draining into the underworld, the watery underworld when there's bloodshed and so forth. I think there's something to this in terms of understanding of soul that has to do with the way in which life flows. And that's really important at a phenomenological level, because it means that you can't dice it up and have a life, right? The experience of being alive is of one thing melding into the other, into another. We live without, as it were, biological clear seams, right? And so there's something to that in this. I think there's also, how can I put this? We, having kind of said, oh, that's part of this kind of old myth, and so we get rid of thinking about blood, or it's not just the blood, it's like we actually get rid of thinking of soul. And once we get rid of thinking of soul as a distinct something, then blood doesn't seem taboo anymore, right? And I think there's there's something lost when we give up on soul. I think there's a distinctive something there, a feature of life that we haven't come up with a replacement term, that's adequate. And so that's the first thing is I think we should take soul seriously, including kind of the liquid metaphors that go with that, because it says something about life that really is distinctive. There is something about being alive, right? Then the second thing is with regard to the resolution in chapter 15 of Acts, is that it's part of a larger picture, which is the decisions there. There's a principle behind the distinctives between, idolatry, things dedicated to idols, sexual immorality, blood, and things strangled, is that all of these show up in the holiness code in Leviticus 17 to 19. And they're the places where, in the midst of a series of prohibitions, the Lord says, this is for you and for the stranger in your midst. In other words, these are places where the Torah addresses Gentiles as Gentiles, but who are living in some relation to Israel, right? So part of what's going on there is it's part of this picture of having a people who, as they follow Jesus, as Messiah, live in some kind of a relation to Israel. And this is an important element of being able to maintain that relation of mutual blessing. And so it's not just, as it were, about the particular command. It's about kind of the relation to Israel as, God's people, that those that follow Jesus as Gentiles, like us, right, would hold. So there's that kind of relational element. So all that to say, well, I'll do this confessionally. So I used to think, well, I don't get that. I don't think souls and blood, so, blood sausage, whatever. And it was some years ago. I was living in Croatia, where they actually serve that a lot. And somebody mentioned it to me. It's like, well, what do you think about this? And where I've come down to is just this. I figure, I don't think I'm, I'm not going to starve for not eating this, right? And where I came to was, there's some things that if I don't understand, but I do it just because, it's what is taught, what's there, that's okay. Maybe at some level, I want to think through as many things as I can, but at some level, there has to be a place for just, I do this just to obey. And that's where I'm at when it comes to blood. So, yeah.
Thanks for the answer. I think, it makes sense that there needs to be a way to separate these Christians that come from the Gentiles, to unify them with Israel, and in a way to separate them at the same time with their old habits. So for this specific period, it makes sense. But today, I still don't know. I'm just wondering if it's okay for us Christians today to, because there isn't at least this danger of idolatry. I mean, this kind of idolatry that existed.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would think about is something like this. So the basic prohibition behind it is against trying to absorb the life force of another. Like just directly take a life force and incorporate it. And that's viewed as, I don't know. So now it's interesting because, apart from any kind of consuming, you now have things like blood washing as a practice, right? With super rich, you've got, they'll buy enough blood from a young person to kind of turn over their blood, and it has regenerative properties and all of that, which means it actually there's more to this than we might think, right? Yeah. And so I don't know. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So it strikes me that blood washing might be a similar kind of thing. I don't know.
But still, I mean,
Yeah.
there is blood donation. We're not
Yeah.
Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, but we can,
Right.
as Christians, we give our blood. It's like a way of it's a sacrifice in a way, and it's so it means for us that there is a different approach to what blood and soul means and what is their connection. Because if it has the same meaning, I think we wouldn't follow these practices as blood donation or
Yeah. So I mean, you've got a whole range of questions. Yeah. So there's blood donation.
This is it,
There's also organ donation and all of this. And so yeah, the kind of the interchangeability of parts of bodies is, it's an element. It needs to be thought through. I think the big distinction there is the difference between donation and taking. Right? I mean, that's the first thing. And second is the difference between, as it were, receiving based upon an actual, like a need where this will save a life, right? Versus just kind of the consuming of another, right? And that's where I think maybe the blood washing might be crossing a line, you know what I mean? But I don't know. I mean, assuming that it's bought, maybe that's a different thing. But anyhow, it's nonetheless that there's a difference when it's donated versus when it's taken. And if it's for the sake of kind of a preservation of life versus just an effort at self-enhancement or something like that. I think those are something you would want to see. And I wouldn't even, there may be a blur. There may be a point where you move from one to the next and it's hard to say where it's at. I'm not saying those are airtight capacities or distinctions between, as it were, preserving a life and enhancing a life, right? There may be some overlap, but I think there's, as it were, clear cases where for sure you're in one or the other, even if there's a blurred middle, you know what I mean? And so things don't have to be airtight to be real categories. So...
What is blood washing?
It is blood washing, yeah. So it's a practice, I think fairly recent. It's like the last 5-10 years, where people will literally have, like, it takes very wealthy people to do this, but they will purchase enough blood from a young person that have, because of stem cells and all of this, and they will literally have their blood drained out and the other blood pumped in. And it has regenerative properties. So look at we're now in the age. So who was it? It was the Irish wit, Oscar Wilde, who said that by age 40 everybody has the face they deserve, right? Well, we're now in the age where by age 80 everybody has the face they can afford, right? So, yeah. So.
I'd be very interested to see the connection between blood and life-giving and the prohibition of consuming blood to the connection with Jesus and communion.
Right.
I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah.
As you were sharing, it just gave me even more depth into that. But I don't know if we digress, but I'd love if you have some thoughts around that.
Yeah. Well, so I think what we want to work with is just this picture of a life force, right? And I think that's the basic thing there, and that what's at heart, what Jesus is doing is he's giving his own life, right, for the sake of others, and offering that now to us. And so it's a donation, right? But as it were, and how do you put this? It's a structured life. It's not just like a life force. It's a structured life, right? And that's also why it comes, in bread and wine, not, not just straight out of a vein, right? It has to do with the passing on of a way of life, as well as the life force that he gave on behalf. So that would be a beginning point, at least. Yeah. So, yeah, Yanis.
So thank you, Daniel, for the insights. 3 questions in one. Is it allowed? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I would
You
like-
only get one answer, but
Yeah,
go ahead. 3 questions.
It's
So,
okay,
I'm
it's
kidding.
okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. So I was thinking first of all about bioethics, because there are many Christian thinkers that they somehow. I'm not talking about being a sin if you consume meat. I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not a vegan. But sometimes I have some thoughts about this. What you said, that we share the same life force, with the animal kingdom, and of course God allowed that. But to which extent, in a modern civilization, this has to do with Christian living and the respect for life in general, and the respect for creation in general also, considering what you said initially, that in the Garden of Eden, it was only fruits and seeds, somehow you were not shedding blood. Number 2, if also we have to do with the human to human, and the retaliation. My question is, to which extent the lex talionis, blood for blood, that we see very often in the Old Testament. However, in the New Testament, you see turn the other cheek of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
And also you see forgive your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, also in the same sermon. We see in the whole Christian world not having like a death penalty that some Christian countries have. Not only, I'm not mentioning just the US, but the idea which is coming from the Old Testament. But in the final events, is this gonna occur again, the lex talionis, in the final wage that Jesus is going to give to each one according to his deeds? So something that started there, to which extent even with the quote unquote, in the Christian era, but then again in the eschaton.
Right.
And third, which is very naive one, but I just want your opinion. I have my answer, but I want your opinion. To which extent Ham is the father of the Africans? Because there are many Christians.
Oh, Ham? Yeah.
Because they just say that because he was
well-
cursed by Noah, he's the father of the Africans, associating it with the slave trade, which occurred later.
Right.
So
So I'll start with the last one because that's super easy. Is actually because we have the list of names of what nations come from whom, and actually all of the great, and this is the irony, the great civilizations of the ancient Middle East, including Babel and Assyria, so Babylon, Assyria, and and Egypt and so forth. All of these come from Ham. And I think that I think there's, and we'll deal with this more next time when we get to the beginnings of nations and Table of Nations and so forth. But I think there's maybe this built into it, that these, so the 3 sons, Ham basically, it's not so much geographical, although there's locations, but kind of types of life that come from the 3. And so you have like the mass civilizations come from Ham. You have the nomadic peoples come from Shem. Those, and then you have the seafarers, like the Greeks, right? They come from Japheth, right? Yeah. So anyhow, and I think the picture is something like this. It's that actually, when you have a mass society that is enslaving others, its own citizens are actually slaves. its own citizens are actually slaves. And so I think there's something like that. So it's a critique of Egypt and Babylon and Assyria in their imperial activity, is that the people there, not talking, so you got one guy on top that runs all kinds of stuff, yeah, and he's got this kind of far-reaching power, but the people themselves, they're actually slaves in the midst of that. And when you get a close look at Egypt, that's clearly the case, is that the nations that's built on slavery, their own people are slaves. And so anyhow, let's see, back to number one. So yes, there's this picture of a kind of an original vegetarianism that's there, and I think it's rooted in this picture of humanity being called upon to be rulers over this world. And it may be as simple as good rulers don't eat their subjects, right? Something like that. But there's also, when you have moments of kind of envisioning and kind of an ideal end society, there's again a kind of a vegetarian picture there, where the lamb and the and the lion lie down together, and and the lion eats straw, right? So there's this. Now, although you have those as kind of ideals, part of what you get here is a kind of a realism that actually human beings and lions can't live off of straw. Right? Like we don't actually have the biological wherewithal to live off of that. But it kind of depicts an ideal in which we wouldn't have to kind of, one form of life wouldn't have to take from another, right? And that's worth having as an ideal, even if it's not practiced, not capable of being practiced, right? And so part of what's going on in these early accounts is this kind of mutual adjustment. And there's things that, as it were, ideally would be great, but they'll never, they're not possible here. Yeah. And so and then with the blood thing, I think it has to do with this idea of trying to absorb another life, and rather than receiving the one we've been given. Something like that is the primary distinction. There was another question in there.
Lex talionis.
Oh, lex talionis, right? Yeah. So two things. First, there are different requirements for kind of individuals as individuals, and families versus states, right? And so and not every ethical requirement of an individual is translatable to a state. Now, that doesn't mean that states have a free pass, right? And part of what you see actually later, so in Genesis, I think it's really instructive in, it's Genesis 18, this kind of back and forth between God and Abram when God's come down to look at Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And it's interesting because you get this, so Abram he's obviously concerned about a particular guy, Lot, his nephew that's living here. And so he starts with this kind of, what if there's 50 righteous people? And so, well, okay, for 50 I won't do it. Well, 40 and 30. And he comes all the way down, and there's this back and forth. But part of what's going on, that starts with God saying he's going to be the father of nations. So that's the reason he's having this conversation, kind of bringing Abraham in on the decision-making process here. And so he goes through this, and what's important is that it actually stops at a certain point. At 10, it stops. It's as if part of what Abraham is learning in this interaction with the Lord is that there's a certain kind of critical mass of goodness in a society beyond which, like if it drops beneath that society's not redeemable, right? And so there's like a point at which, you know, there has to be enough, right? There has to be enough. And so he stops at 10. It's as if Abraham realizes, because, you know, as he starts to think in terms of being the father of a nation, that there has to be this. Now, what's interesting is the Lord nonetheless saves the one that he, you know, that he cares about. He doesn't say he's going to, but he does it. He often does much more than he promises, right? But part of what I see here is, and this is, you know, it's there in kind of the Romans 13 thing and so forth also, is that there are responsibilities for seeing to it the bloodshed does not proliferate that is there on you know, in governments, right, of whatever sort they are, right, that doesn't go away. And so, yeah, I think there is still, as it were, justice to be dealt in those terms. But we as just, you know, as Christ followers, as individuals, it's not ours to seek. It's not ours to seek. It's not my job to do that, right? And so, so that's where I have to let go. If I somehow found myself in a position where I was kind of, you know, forced to sit on a throne somewhere, then I'd have to deal with this, right?
So it's the collectivistic with the individualistic somehow.
Yeah. And I think there's things that we can do and even have to do as part of a, you know, as a role that we would not be justified in doing as individuals. That's my sense. I don't know if that's sufficient, but hey. So, yeah. Good questions. Tough ones. Yeah.
May I also
Go for it.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize.
No. Yeah. Carly's
I
still
was
trying to
thinking-
formulate
I
her
was
one, I can
thinking
see.
I was thinking about the question of the blood of Christ, you know, in the Last Supper. And that's not my thought, but I want to share, you know, it's a thought of a friend. He said, don't misunderstand me, but he said, look, all these cannibalistic civilizations, by drinking the blood, they were thinking that they're receiving the power of the enemy that was killed.
Yeah.
And somehow, I don't want to make the association, just to bring it into the conversation, when Jesus is giving his blood and is asking from us to drink it, is like, is metaphorically or for some Christians even literally, you know, to take the power, you know, of his life within us. Okay, take it or leave it, just, it's a thought.
Well, I think that is, like I said, he's offering his life. But the important point there is it's not just, as it were, a disconnected life force. It's actually a structured life. There's life force in it, but it's a structured life when we receive Christ. And that's part of what makes it different. But it's also why it's quite unrepeatable. You know, yeah. Any other thoughts or? All right. Well, thanks for the conversation and for processing this. So what I plan to do next time, which by the way won't be until towards the end of April, because we've got Pascha coming up and all that, but we'll look at kind of the emergence of nations and what that has to do with this, and you get this kind of back in these two poles of nation versus empire, and so we'll kind of think through those in terms of what that has to do with human identity also. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Blessings.